Hello, friends, and welcome to Season 2 of The Membership. Just a quick note here before we get started. First of all, we want to thank all of you, our listeners, for the support you showed us during Season 1. From the in-person comments we received at the recording of our live first episode, to all of your kind and thoughtful iTunes reviews, social media posts, and emails, the amount of support our fellow members have given us has been wonderful. It's this support that inspires us to continue our work and to want to make the podcast even better in Season 2 and beyond. And we're hoping some of you can help us. While we certainly understand that not all of our fellow members will be able to support us financially, we'd like to ask those of you who are to consider making a monthly donation through Patreon at patreon.com/membershippod. Your donations will go toward covering the costs associated with the podcast, including website hosting fees, recording equipment, editing help, and travel costs for future interview episodes. And any amount that you can afford to donate will be a huge help, even if it's just $1 a month. All monthly patrons at the $1 a month level or above will be invited to a private Facebook group where we'll post special updates about upcoming episodes, bonus content, and even share unedited episodes and interviews. So go to patreon.com/membershippod to pitch in today. Hello, friends, and welcome to Season 2, Episode 1 of The Membership, a podcast about the life and work of Wendell Berry, the Kentucky farmer, poet, novelist, essayist, activist, and thinker. My name is Jason Hardy, and I'm joined today by one of my usual fellow members.
Hi, this is Tim Wasem.
John Pattison, unfortunately, couldn't be with us to record tonight, but rest assured that he is still very much a part of the project and will be with us again soon.
In episode 2.
Yeah. Tonight, we will be discussing The Hidden Wound, Berry's book on race. And to help us with this discussion, we're thrilled to welcome another member, our guest, Dr. Heather Finch. Dr. Finch earned her BA at Tuskegee University and her MA and PhD at Auburn University. She is now an assistant professor of English at my alma mater, Belmont University. Her research and teaching experience and interests include early American and African American literature, with a specific emphasis on the fragmented narratives of pre-19th century enslaved women and freedom. Her higher education and professional experience also includes diversity and inclusion work, and you can learn more about her work at www.heathermfinch.com. Dr. Finch, welcome to the membership.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to have this opportunity to talk with y'all.
Yeah, we're very thrilled to have you. I wonder, before we jump into talking about The Hidden Wound, if you wouldn't mind just sort of letting us know what your experience with Wendell Berry had been before you came to The Hidden Wound.
My experience with Wendell Berry had been very limited. I recently have been doing some work with a colleague on environmental justice, as well as a student on some ecology work. So through learning with them, I had a renewed interest in bell hooks. And through that connection there that they have with Kentucky, I had kind of begun to think about him a little bit.
Sure.
So when I had this opportunity to read The Hidden Wound, I thought, well, it would give me a chance to think a little bit more about him and his work. But before then, I just not really spent a lot of time with his work.
And that's great. I think we need to have more people on the podcast who are just coming to Berry. I think it can be easy as for us as you know, people who've been influenced by Berry and read him a lot to just sort of fall into hero worship or just always always sort of agreeing with what he has to say. So we definitely welcome a new perspective.
Yeah,
for sure.
It's always it's refreshing to have somebody with a fresh set of eyes on something that we might be a little too precious with.
Yeah.
So
a little bit. We'll see.
We'll see.
Well, I'll go ahead and jump in here with a brief summary of The Hidden Wound, and we can jump into talking about it. The Hidden Wound is, I call it a book-length essay that was originally published in 1970 and then republished with a new afterword in 1988. The hidden wound of the title, of course, is racism, specifically the racism of white people toward black people in the wake of slavery in the South. The thrust of Berry's argument is that while slavery and racism, institutional and otherwise, have wounded and still wound black people, they have wounded and still wound white people in ways that white people have largely hidden from themselves. The essay includes highly personal passages. Berry reckons at length with the fact that his great-grandfather was a slave owner, and he examines the relationship he had as a child with a black couple who worked for his grandfather. And it also includes analytical passages that connect racism to issues of economics, culture, and even ecology. And what we end up with is, probably unsurprisingly, an agrarian critique of racism. Berry argues that the logic behind slavery and racism and the logic behind modern industrial capitalism are one and the same, and that this logic is responsible for the disintegration of American culture, which of course includes our broken race relations. So Heather and Tim, what do y'all make of that as a summary? Am I leaving anything significant out? Or?
Scale of 1 to 10.
Scale of 1. Yeah.
1 to 10. No, I think you did. I think you did really well because as I read through it, and we'll talk about this, of course, I thought, how would I summarize this? And I thought you did a really good job with that.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, it strikes me, or when I was reading it, it struck me as I had not read this previously to preparing for this episode. This was my first time, and this was much more. There was much more memoir to this than I was expecting to see, and
right.
that was always, and that always makes his. I think my favorite of his essays are the ones that have that element because he's the kind of, which we've talked about, I think, in previous episodes about the documentary, how he is one who desperately doesn't want to put the focus on himself, which I think is an admirable thing for him. I mean, but he can't help but bring himself into discussing issues. And so I really love that as you read through his essays and you read through something like this, he's sort of making his case for whatever ideas he has, but at the same time, you're getting some insight into who he is personally, which is really valuable to me as a fan of his work.
Sure. And I didn't let y'all know that I was going to do this, but as I was sort of preparing today, I figured it might be good before we sort of dive into discussing it to read just a little bit from the opening to the essay, just to sort of give our listeners who maybe haven't read the book, just a little bit of a sense of what Berry is saying in his own words about the project. I'll just sort of pick up from the first chapter. For whatever reasons, good or bad, I have been unwilling until now to open in myself what I have known all along to be a wound, a historical wound prepared centuries ago to come alive in me at my birth, like a hereditary disease, and to be augmented and deepened by my life. If I had thought it was only the black people who had suffered from the years of slavery and racism, then I could have dealt fully with the matter long ago. I could have filled myself with pity for them, and would no doubt have enjoyed it a great deal and thought highly of myself. But I am sure that it is not so simple as that. If white people have suffered less obviously from racism than black people, they have nevertheless suffered greatly. The cost has been greater, perhaps, than we can yet know. If the white man has inflicted the wound of racism upon black men, the cost has been that he would receive the mirror image of that wound into himself. As the master or as a member of the dominant race, he has felt little compulsion to acknowledge it or speak of it. The more painful it has grown, the more deeply he has hidden it within himself. But the wound is there, and it is a profound disorder, as great a damage in his mind as it is in his society. So hopefully that just gives a little bit of a flavor of the way Berry himself sets out at the beginning of the book. To introduce what he's going for. And
I would also add, I think that's an excellent passage to start with, and I'm going to throw in the last sentence of that chapter where he says, and so maybe I am really saying only that I feel an obligation to make the attempt, and that I know if I fail to make at least the attempt, I forfeit any right to hope that the world will become better than it is now. So it's kind of, I read that as kind of like sort of mission statement that I'm probably going to miss the mark here at some point, but I'm never going to be able to live with myself if I don't try.
Right.
So I think that was that caught me as I was reading that first chapter.
So what do you all make of that as sort of a way of a launching off point for the essay?
Well, I thought it was an important way to start, especially for someone like me coming into this relatively new to his work, and also thinking through what to expect in this work. To see him use direct language like wound, even talking about the historical perspective there as well, I became really invested in trying to understand what he would share with us based on his experiences, and really become a part of, as Tim stated earlier, like this memoir that will not only give me a glimpse into what it's like on a personal level to grapple with these things, but to also think about how it fits in a larger system of oppression and how people understand the workings of it all.
Yeah, that's well said. I came into this with, I think this will come out more later as we talk about this, but in the area where Jason and I live, and like I'm a teacher myself, and so the students that I work with, I was really struck at how that language, like you said, the language of the wound, about how this hidden wound is something that, as he describes it, at least is something that I've maybe noticed over the years, but would never have been able to put the words to it in the way that he did. And so I found myself writing names like in the margins, and also things about myself where I was just like, whoa, wait a second. Oh, wait a second. The self-awareness of the essay was really helpful to me as an educator and somebody who's working and teaching in a place where I want to be the best voice possible to help my students grow,
Yeah. Well, let's go ahead and just sort of on a preliminary level, thinking about the work as a whole now, just to shape the conversation that follows. Wonder if we could just each give at least a sense of our individual reactions to the book. Did you like it? Did you not? At a high level, what do you see as its overall strengths and weaknesses? Heather, we'll start with you, if you don't mind.
Okay. I do not mind. So for me, my reaction was mixed. Definitely found strength in his vulnerability, his thoughtfulness. I often found myself grateful at moments that he said the things I wished he would say. And because of that, I was invested in this work with him to an extent. My other mixed emotions just came from a personal experience, just because by the time I was 5 years old, I had to understand race because I'm a Black woman. And I thought, what a privilege to get a chance to think about it at this depth later in life. And so for that, I just had some mixed emotions at times, because I thought, what if the conversation for me started, after having been educated in particular ways during college, or having had a chance to kind of grow and experience life a different way. So that was just much more of a personal reaction, because I thought, wow,
Sure.
He had these experiences, but there were no clear, direct, or, as we often call it, the quote unquote talk that was had with him. And so I thought, if I sat down and wrote through my understandings of race, it would look different. And it would start probably about 5 years old, when my dad had to explain some things to me. And so I thought, what a privilege that is, and wondered, what do people do with that type of privilege?
Yeah, that's powerful.
In my sort of, I guess, bird's eye view of the book, I also had sort of mixed reaction to it, and the way that it sort of hit me was that I found myself leaving the book with a lot of little nuggets that were fascinating to me, or a little, where he brings in some sort of Thoreau connection, or he brings in some sort of biographical note about one of these characters that really intrigued me, or he makes a certain point. So I had all these little nuggets, but then when I zoomed out and saw it as a whole, I started to stumble a little more in what I felt about the text, because I felt like he starts out in the first couple chapters with something that's very focused, and it's very, what he's going for. And he seems, I don't know if this is the right word, but he almost seems like like, I'm going to do this courageous. I'm going to try to do something that's really hard, and I'm going to go for it. And he dives right in. But in some ways, it sort of dissolves, or not dissolves, but just kind of like spreads out so thin that by the end of it, to a certain extent, I don't know if like the thread is lost. I don't know if that's fair, but by the end of it, and I don't know if it's because of him. This seems like a lot more like an improvised essay. I mean, he even says about how it was written that he wrote it in a relatively short period of time and just kind of sat down and decided to plow through this. And I'm sure he spent time revising and stuff like that. But he definitely let himself just sort of follow his train of thoughts in kind of a liberal way, and so by the end of it, and I think maybe another factor in there is he seems to have despite some aspects that I'm sure we'll get into later, he seems to have a sensitivity to how a pretty strong sensitivity to how he's talking about parts of this story. And I don't know if the way that he's approaching it then makes him sort of thin himself out as he goes, instead of keeping that really focused drive that he had at the beginning. I don't know if you guys agree with. I don't know if you agree with that or not.
I do.
I could see that. Yeah.
Yeah. I agree with you, because I started thinking, because before you get into that first chapter, I know you all remember he has that little, he has a couple of quotes from different authors, but he starts with that autobiography of Malcolm X, the piece there where he talks about the system and all of that. And I thought, oh, wow, he's ready to really be in conversation about this. And then when we get a little deeper in and he goes back to Malcolm X's work again, he taken like this ecological turn.
Yeah.
That I wasn't.
About like keeping a garden or something. It's like,
right. And so I thought, wow, he really did, as you say, kind of thin himself out for whatever reasons. I'm not sure what happens, but I definitely noticed that as well.
Yeah.
he always gets back on brand eventually.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I think I agree with you all. There were definitely parts of it that I found powerful and profound and helpful. Especially the passages like the one I read where he is showing Heather, like you mentioned, vulnerability and really looking at himself as a privileged white man and trying to figure out what that means and at whose cost he has been privileged. I think those kinds of passages of moral introspection, I think, are helpful to me as a white man trying to make sense of my own privilege and place in systems that are oppressive. And obviously I really love the memoir passages, some of the stories he tells about Nick and Georgie, the couple who had worked for his grandfather that he knew when he was a child, when he's showing rather than telling. In some cases, it's more powerful. But, there are definitely some parts of his argument later on that I'm sure we'll get to that I took issue with, or at least had some questions about. We can get to those. We can get to those later. Some of it has to do with the fact that it was published in 1970, and certainly norms and things have changed since then. But I think there are still some issues to look into there.
And I would, on that sort of in that vein, as far as a starting point, even though we're 20 minutes in or whatever, like it's a starting point. He tells the stories of Nick and George. He also has the story of the other, and I forget the name of the other individual that is taken in the middle of the night. It's that family story.
His great grandfather's, his great grandfather's slave. Yeah.
Yeah. So I feel like that's definitely worth pointing out, as far as everything sort of rises out of the stories of Nick and Georgie and how they affected him and taught him these certain things through his life. But then there's also that story, which is the one that he talks about just being like sort of casually thrown around and discussed as a family, but not really. It doesn't seem like a heavy opinion has been given about what happened. It's just kind of like there's this story about his grandfather's slave who was just like obstinate or whatever, and then he is in the middle of the night taken away by this guy who ends up becoming this like notorious Confederate colonel or whatever it is. And that's a heavy, really heavy story that he's starting with. And so that's one of the things I think it's important pointing out, that that's another thing that he's trying to make sense of. Seems like a cheap thing to say, because I don't think he ever could. It's impossible. Right. But to try to like find himself in, or maybe find some sort of pathway through that story that makes him better understand his own family or his own place where he comes from, because we know that's always what he's sort of aiming for ultimately.
Right.
So let's dig in a little more specifically, and let's maybe start with maybe pulling out some passages and or key points, key moments that we feel like really worked, or that we really liked. So, what do you all think worked from a rhetorical standpoint, or what stuck out to you as profound or helpful as we consider issues of race? And obviously, feel free to point to particular passages that you'd like to discuss.
I think one thing I wanted to point out, especially when considering what Tim just highlighted with the slave, where it's challenging for him to make sense of this enslaved person's experience in relation to what he'd learned through his family. And in chapter 6, there's that point where he talks about the Joe Louis fight and where they eat supper and all of that. And at one point, he said something that stuck with me that was really helpful as I thought about what it's like for him to think through this and what it's like for probably a lot of white people as they try to make sense of how they are suffering as well under these systems of oppression. And he says, it was one of those complex operations of race consciousness that a small child will comprehend with his feelings and yet perhaps never live long enough to unravel with his mind. And I just was taken aback by that, because if you're being socialized in particular ways, if you are seeing models of investment in certain parts of these systems, it will be challenging to unravel all of that. I couldn't imagine having learned about something like the enslaved person and then never truly having an in-depth discussion about what all that meant. And then you carry that with you. And then his own personal experiences with Nick and Georgie. And he carries those things with him. And then he grows up and goes into the world in different ways. And then how is he ever supposed to make sense of it? That may be why his piece kind of thins out for us, because he may have been thought to himself while he was writing all of this, like, okay, what am I going to end up on? What am I going to really be able to make sense of with all of this? And as he told us in the beginning, it was going to be an attempt he felt he needed to do. But I could only imagine how challenging that is to try to unravel all of this and think about it, especially when there's not a direct discussion about, I think you all mentioned earlier about a clear opinion about anything. It's kind of like, here's some facts. I think this is part of what I've heard in conversation, but there's never this moment where anyone says, you know, this is absolutely wrong, or this is why we do this, or this is something you shouldn't do or you should do. And then he's left to kind of deal with all of that and try to unravel it.
Yeah, that passage and all those passages around him trying to make sense of the story that his family told over and over about the time that this particular slave, his grandfather had to sell him, and then he was knocked out in the middle of the night and taken away by the slave. I guess it was the slave trader or whatever that they had sold him to, and
Jenkins, I think was his name.
Yeah. And there's an awful lot of imagination that Berry goes into there, thinking about his great grandfather as he knew him and as he had heard him talked about as this, supposedly mild mannered person who, in other respect, might have been thought of as a good person, but this moment, this story that gets passed around, one of the reasons he throws out for it having been passed around is that it was a moment where the violence of the system of slavery that white people had explained away by making, talking about slavery as some kind of benign paternalistic institution, it was enforced by and undergirded by violence, even when the slave owners themselves may not have been violent in certain cases, though in lots of cases, at least, they certainly were. But it's enforced by violence when they have to sell a slave away, and that became apparent to the family in that moment, and it was unmasked, and so you sort of have this trauma that goes through the family, and that the story gets passed down, but they to actually deal with it in the open and to call what happened evil would be to admit an awful lot more that they don't, and that is the hidden wound that he's talking about.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think, I think you mentioned this, Heather, at the beginning. I mean, I think just the language of the wound, or a sickness, of that racism is, thinking about racism in those terms, I think is helpful to me, at least insofar as it kind of gives it, I guess, in my mind, a spiritual dimension, or a
Right.
moral dimension. And it also at least gestures toward the idea that health or healing or wholeness is something that is at least possible to be worked for.
Right.
And I think that's what he's at least setting out to do.
Yeah, and that brings me to one of my sort of favorite things that he approaches in this book, just to kind of springboard off that, is when he, pretty early on, and in my book it's on page 16, but he approaches the religious approach to this in like the Southern Baptist Church, which I'm sure that I'm not, in reporting what I'm about to say, I'm not making generalizations about these churches these days, but like he makes a really powerful point, just for starters, that he says, but also consider this congregation of masters and slaves from the point of view of the pulpit. How, facing that mixture and dependent on the white half of it for your livelihood, would you handle such a text as the Sermon on the Mount? It's like imagine being a slave owner and reading the Sermon on the Mount. Like,
Right.
Unbelievable, right?
Yeah.
And so he says, oh, sure, it would be even practical to teach slaves such things as resist not evil, but whoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also. And he goes through these ones that's like, oh, you can totally see how they would justify something like that. But then he flips it and says, but what about the masters when it says, he that saith I know him and keepeth not his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. So it's like you'd run into all these problems. And so he gets into this description of how through the mechanisms of slavery and because the church was, its pocketbook was lined with money from the slave trade, and through these people who were fully invested in the use of slaves, that sort of changed the church itself in that all of the focus was put on you just have to believe, right? It's not about the way you act or how you treat people. You just say that you believe, which then he even goes into like making the comparison, I think, to like the people who go out and raise hell all weekend and then show up at church and just say like, but I believe, so forgive me. And so it becomes that like sort of, that's what the Southern church was punctuated by throughout that time, because that was their way of talking it away, of saying like, oh, nobody's perfect. Surely I'm not perfect, but I believe, and so I will be I will be welcomed into heaven or whatever. And I like that he very immediately calls that out and calls out the Southern Baptist way of thinking, or at least this Southern Baptist way of thinking, as being just bogus mysticism. So
yeah, I resonated with that as well, because I kind of grew up with that kind of approach to what one might call the gospel, right? The idea that you need to believe a certain set of truth propositions, and if you do, you're going to heaven, and that's basically that's basically the long and the short of it, right?
John 3:16.
Right.
That's the only thing
Right.
that exists in the Bible is John 3:16.
And forget that the Christian tradition has lots of other sort of resources, and heaven forbid that we actually talk about claims that religion might have on our lives, in terms of how we might act. I mean, I really that was definitely one of the things I marked down, was his critique of a kind of theology that won't ever really talk about how we're supposed to live in this life, because it's so focused on the next life. Thought that was, and how that was brought into service of the slave trade and racism more broadly. It was interesting that, and I have I don't have the expertise to corroborate this, but he does cite a historian saying that in the early part, like the late 18th and early 19th century, there are documents from people, upholding the separation between church and state in the state of Kentucky, because the clergy people were so apt to talk against the slave trade. And then you had this development of this other kind of religion that followed on along with that. Heather, how did his discussion of Southern religion, at least as of 1970, how did that strike you?
I think that, of course, it was appropriate because you can't really talk about enslavement without talking about a lot of the things he mentioned, economic endeavors as well as religious roles in this. So I thought that it was courageous as well, because sometimes that's part of the hidden wound that I can kind of gather from reading his work, is that here are all these different things, all these different layers where you're considering even you going into a religious experience, and still whatever it is that you believe about enslavement, particularly being pro-slavery, is one of the things that religion says is okay based on how the scripture is rearranged in certain ways. So I think for me, it was part of that vulnerability and thoughtfulness for him to include all of that. Definitely, if we're thinking credibility wise, I think it just built his credibility even more for me, that he's thought through all of the different factors that make it challenging for us to, even today, to continue to try to think through the racial systems, how racism plays out in people's everyday lives, and how we begin to think about the various areas where you will. I think people still continue to say, right, that particularly in the South, Sundays are the most segregated days. I guess if we're still doing 11 a.m. service, that would mean that at 11 a.m. is probably the most segregated hour. And recently, over at Belmont, we had a speaker. He's a pastor, and someone asked him, like, how do we integrate our church services? Like, how does that work? And even listening to some of that discussion, I just could hear a lot of the tangles, right, that have just been, that are still there from all the things that we think back through historically. The church is still very tangled up in all of that, and they're still trying to figure out the impact of that as someone who was genuinely wanting to know how could they come together. But we can see, as Berry shows us, that there's a lot there, right? A part of this wound for everybody, the suffering, both Black and white people. Like, how can you now use this religious experience to say, okay, we're gonna look at what Jesus is telling us when the experience has been different for some people in their religious past. And so I don't know how that works out in our present day.
Yeah.
But I think that it only added to his credibility to highlight that, because I think a lot of times that's one of the things that people want to kind of rush over as they think about racism, because particularly those of us who are Christians and who are part of Christianity, we do and hope that we are trying to do it right. But that critique is still something that I think people run away from. And for him to do this in 1970 is important.
That's gonna fester. That thought of 11 o'clock Sunday morning being the most segregated time in America these days.
Right, yeah.
I mean, absolutely. And that's being on the subject. Yeah, it does just immediately make you think of, so what's different about then versus now in a lot of ways, right? I mean, the same structures are kind of in place, but it's like the world acts as if like, yeah, but we're being a little nicer to each other. And so we're being a little nicer to each other. So that's how it's been. So we'll just stick with that. And that's how, and that's what we'll expect from the world around us. But hey, we like each other. We're being nice to each other. So that's something that I don't have a whole lot else to say on, because it's just something that I need to wrestle with myself some more.
Yeah.
For sure. Because I mean, you look at religion at any point, I would say, and I'm being very broad now, but you look at religion and you look at the makeup of a church, so to speak, and it'll tell you a lot about the community, right? Because someone said that to me. They were like, well, remember, people go to the church that's in their community, right? And so then you go, well, that does make sense. And we're still reeling from segregation, right? Which created these neighborhoods and communities where everyone's separated legally in many places, particularly in the South with Jim Crow. And then today you look up and you go like, well, that's still very clear because there are still neighborhoods and pockets. And then you go into the church that only shows you so much about multiple identities, whether it's race, as we're talking about right now, or social economic status, accessibility to different types of education. And so I think that having a discussion about religion really does help us think about how we are in conversation with each other, and that sometimes our religious affiliations, whatever it may be, is oftentimes a mirror into our communities and a mirror into how those communities get that way, and why they're that way. And so it is something to think about. Like I said, I know that now a lot of times churches, religious organizations, they have multiple services now. You can go on a Saturday night, you can go on a Sunday evening, but this idea that people are still trying to figure out, well, how can we gather around our religious faith, if we're Christian or whatever people may be, how do we kind of get ourselves in the same spaces? And that was just telling for me how they try to have that conversation, and no one really came up with like a really good, I guess, starting space, because they were concerned about power dynamics, right? Because what's set up in these experiences that we see, thinking about someone like Berry, is that there are still power dynamics at play. So you have people, someone made the description of, well, someone has gone to work in what people may describe as menial labor all week long, but then they can come to church on Sunday morning and be a deacon. But what happens if we then see that power dynamic shift because of the integration of the churches, and they feel that a power play has happened where they can no longer be the deacon, that they don't have a safe space? And I don't know the answer to all of that, but it just kind of showed how tangled up all of it is, that sometimes we wish that, you know, we go to church on Sunday and, hey, all things are solved. And like you were saying earlier, we're nice to each other. We hug and hold hands when we're praying, but that even in those small moments, they are glimpses of hope, but there's a lot to unravel there to really think through in terms of what these religious experiences tell us about ourselves and our communities.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. And he talks about how basically the way that America functions in dealing with change is just like, well, we'll leave it for the next generation to deal with it. You know, he says, and I couldn't help but think about like Greta Thunberg or you know, with like climate change issues, but like with this, with the churches, it's I think the same way, where it's like we always instill. I'm thinking of there's a song. I'm a big fan of the Avett Brothers, and they have a new album that's out, and they have a song called "We Americans," and it makes the point in one point in the song, which is about they actually use the phrase "scars of a nation," like laws may change, but we can't erase the scars of a nation, and it's kind of on this topic, and he says that we're only 2 lifetimes removed from slavery, which we don't say that out loud. Like, I mean, not much more than 2 lifetimes removed from slavery. So we're still like if you think about it from that sort of zoomed out perspective, we're still in the middle of it, where people are just saying like, well, my parents were more used to it and I'm a little more progressive and my kids will be a little more progressive, and then it'll keep going that way. But that's just like the laziest long game you can possibly imagine.
Right.
I'm trying to find the passage where he talks about he says, the great moral tasks of honesty and peace and neighborliness and brotherhood in the case of the earth have been left to be taken up on the streets by the, quote, alienated youth of the 60s and 70s. So he's like giving a shout out to these sort of progressive movements that are happening in the 60s and 70s. But it's just kind of like, that's their thing. They'll take care of this. And now I point that out and bring it up because as I think about it, it's 2019. The exact same thing is happening today. Right. Not a whole lot has changed in the last 50 years. So as far as that sort of model of thinking through solving a problem, which I have to, I mean, it's hard to change your mind. Like I feel like the strongest people I know are people who are willing to change their mind on things. And it's even harder to change other people's people's minds. So it's just like, it really is. It's a staggering task that he, as we've sort of used before, is like courageously trying to approach at a time when wouldn't have been a terribly popular time to approach it from the way in the way that he's approaching it, I think. Yeah. Right. I also think of, and I'd like to while we're on the subject of religion, there's a passage in chapter 6 where we get a distinction between Barry's grandfather's version of God and Nick's version of God, which I really liked that passage where and he says, he's talking about Nick here, but he says, when he spoke of the Lord, he called him, as my grandfather did, the old master, by which they meant a God of mystery, the maker of weather and seasons, of abundance and dearth, of growth and death, a God far more remote and far less talkative than the God of the churches. So I guess I misspoke when I said grandfather versus Nick. It's like grandfather and Nick have this sort of understanding and this sort of attitude towards an idea of God that affects Barry because it seems to be a sidestep from the way that the church talks about it, in this sort of like, just believe and you'll be forgiven and everything will be fine. It's more of like I don't know what you call that, an Old Testament God or something, right? The way that he sees that. And I thought that was really interesting to me as a Barry fan, and seeing how that thinking speaks to all the novels that I've read in the past couple decades and in his poetry, because you can see how that has seeped into the rest of his work.
Yeah. I wonder if we could talk just a little bit about Nick and Georgie. I mean, I think I mentioned earlier, those are some of the passages that stood out as the most powerful to me when he is talking about how he interacted with them as a child. I'd like to read what I think is the most moving passage in that, and that is the passage where he talks about his birthday party. And I'll just jump in here and read through it. But the clearest of all my own acts of taking sides happened at a birthday party my grandfather gave for me when I must have been 9 or 10 years old. As I remember, she invited all the family and perhaps some of the neighbors. I issued one invitation of my own, to Nick. I believed that in my eagerness to have him come, and assuming that as my friend he ought to be there, I foresaw none of the social awkwardness that I created. But I had, in fact, surrounded us all with the worst sort of discomfort. Nick, trying to compromise between his wish to be kind to me and his embarrassment at my social misconception, quit work at the time of the party and came and sat on the cellar wall behind the house. By that time, even I had begun to see the uneasiness I had created. I had done a thing more powerful than I could have imagined at the time. I had scratched the wound of racism, and all of us, our heads beclouded in the social dream that all was well, were feeling the pain. It was suddenly evident to me that Nick neither would nor could come into the house and be a member of the party. My grandmother, to her credit, allowed me to follow my instincts in dealing with the situation, and I did. I went out and spent the time of the party sitting on the cellar wall with Nick. It was obviously the only decent thing I could have done. If I had thought of it in moral terms, I would have had to see it as my duty. But I didn't. I didn't think of it in moral terms at all. I did simply what I preferred to do. If Nick had no place at my party, then I would have no place there either. My place would be where he was. The cellar wall became the place of a definitive enactment of our friendship, in which, by the grace of a child's honesty and a man's simple-hearted generosity, we transcended our appointed roles. I like the thought of the two of us sitting out there in that sunny afternoon eating ice cream and cake, with all my family and my presence in there in the house without me. I was full of a sense of loyalty and a love that clarified me to myself as nothing ever had before. It was a time I would like to live again. And he sort of goes on to talk about the position of a child within this social situation of racism, of institutionalized racism. And he points to, I think, what he calls the sort of the moral resources of childhood, which, at least for someone who is white, who doesn't have to, as you said, Heather, experience that racism more viscerally early on of necessity. It's a time of innocence, to where he can sort of look back on the way he reacted to Nick. He couldn't help but be his friend because he was a likable man. He was a generous man, and he taught him things, and he let him follow him around while he was working, even though it was probably more of a nuisance than anything for him to do so. Right. But there's this moral memory of how he had reacted or how he had developed this relationship with Nick, that he is sort of saying that he's looking back to as he's trying to make sense of race as an adult. What did you all make of that and of his portrayal of Nick and Georgie as well, on the whole?
On that story, I would just, the only really little thing I would add, and this is probably, Dr. Finch, we've talked about how of our three hosts, one of us is like a fiction person. And this is all accidental, but like one's a fiction person, one's a poetry person, and one's an essay person for Barry's work. And for me, I'm the fiction person. Like, what really hits me, and I just sit there and I like, as he was reading that again, I immediately got the exact same image in my head, which is a young Wendell Berry with his crew cut or whatever he would have had at the time, just like sitting on this cellar wall, kind of kicking his legs and just totally innocently eating cake and ice cream and sitting by his best friend. And I don't even imagine him saying anything. I just imagine them sitting there. I imagine him just being like it says in the passage, this is where I preferred to be. Like, well, this party sucks. I'm going out and sit with Nick, like my closest confidant. And so I think of that, and then I think of the deep pain that Nick must have been feeling in that moment.
Gosh, that awkwardness of like not knowing what to do, and and
just being like probably worried about like, worried about, are people going to blame this on me that he's missing his birthday party because he wants to be with me, which just breaks my heart to imagine that he would have that thought. But from later on in the book, I sort of lean towards the idea that both of them are, to a certain extent, sitting there content, and Nick is enjoying the little things of sitting there with a break in the middle of the day and enjoying the sunshine, and is able to appreciate this little bit of time. But I still just, like, my heart breaks when I think of him sitting there and not being it with a little kid. I don't know how old was he? What does it say? What birthday it was? 10, yeah. It's like 9 or 10. Like, and imagine, like, he's not going to sort of bring up this topic to him. He's just going to be like, well, this is what's going to happen. So it's sort of like that sort of fictional scene in my head, or not fictional scene, this narrative scene in my head, just, it weighed really heavily on me as I was reading it.
Yeah, I think I agree with you on thinking about Nick's experience with this, because he's navigating that tension that he probably always had to navigate, in terms of figuring out how to toe whatever line was presented to him at any given moment. And here was a moment where he felt probably pulled, or felt the tension from all of it, but was able to make the best decision for him, because he knew that this could go either way, because Barry would probably want to know where he is anyway. He knew that the space of the birthday party itself was not a space created for him. Even though Barry doesn't get that, he knows that very well. And so trying to navigate that tension, because there are times when Barry talks about that silence, the tension, the anxiety, with all of this. And so by this time, Nick probably has had plenty of experience figuring out how to make the best decision for himself, but to also know how to do that with the family too. So I do think about him and what are his inner thoughts? What is he thinking as he's making all these multiple decisions, no telling how many times a day or in any given week, to ensure that, he doesn't make a decision that could possibly, cost him his job, cost him his life, whatever, could occur for him. And so he probably had a lot of experience with it. I see him as a very strong man with few words in the moments where he knows that's not going to be, probably the best decision. And I ache for that too, to spend your life not truly being able to make the decisions that speak your truth, and to be able to speak to what you honestly feel about those that you love and those who are around you. And it's just hard to grasp. It's hard to grasp that. And I know for Barry, it would be hard for him to grasp, because he doesn't know at that young age how to make sense of all of it. And probably even now in his older age, probably still doesn't know how to make sense of what it would be like to be Nick, and what Nick thought and what he felt. But to just kind of have been in that space with him, he knew was I'm trying to make sure I use the word, the decent thing to do.
Yeah, he had an undeniable, just sort of innocent magnetic pull towards Nick, because he had like a genuine love for him. Just like those when he tells that story about the Joe Louis fights, which Dr. Finch you referred to earlier, but like that he could have sat at home and listened to those and had dinner with his family, but he was like, no, I'm going to go with Nick on this little pilgrimage that he always does, which is to go to the next, just because he can, he's going to go over to the next house over and he's going to listen to it there. And Barry would go over there, and his argument, I guess, like little Wendell would be like, well, there's another little boy over there and we'll go and we'll play. But he was going there because he just had this magnetic attraction to him. In general, and a magnetic attraction that he also shared, I think, with Georgie, of course. And so, which we haven't talked about Georgie a whole lot yet either. But
yeah, what did y'all make of Barry's portrayal and sort of what he does to make sense of Georgie and her influence on his life?
Well, I mean, one little thing that definitely jumps out to me is he quickly points out that Aunt Fanny from A Place on Earth was a direct influence of Georgie.
Yeah.
And so I think that for any character to be, and he acknowledges like the differences between them, but for any character to just be a direct pull from somebody, I can sort of, with the mind of a fledgling fiction writer in my own head, like I can imagine that feeling of like Georgie being the super special person to him that he had to like, I'm going to use her as a character somewhere, and so it's got to be done right. I've got to do it well and do her justice. And so and A Place on Earth is one of my favorite of his books. So that jumped out to me initially, but she seemed to have and I'm interested to hear what you all say about this, but Georgie's influence on him, like while Nick's was more work ethic and attitude and the way that he saw and approached the world, Georgie's effect on him was his storytelling rock or whatever.
Yeah.
That was the person who sort of informed his storytelling a lot because of the way that she preached and the way that she told these stories. I love how he points out that she had 3 obsessions, and it was God, Africa, and Germany.
Yeah.
That's the three things that she loved to talk about. I think that's what, or was it hell? No, it was hell, Africa, and Germany were the 3 things that she like could just kind of go off on, but whatever. But I would like to hear what you all think about that, just as far as like the storytelling influence on Barry from Aunt Georgie.
That's exactly what I thought about with her. She was the one with the stories. He's the one that kind of got his inspiration about storytelling from her. And what sticks out to me most is once Nick dies and she leaves, in a sense that kind of left a mark on him. And I don't know how to describe that, but it stuck out to me most because I don't think he really anticipated probably even Nick's death or what would happen to Georgie. So with all of that, he hadn't really thought about her influence on his life, particularly until that moment. And once he realized she was about to leave and how much she was a part, he says, like, I think this is chapter 8. Yeah. He says, and all at once I realized that Aunt Georgie was going to leave. I hadn't expected it. She was deeply involved in my history and my affections. She'd been there, what seemed to me, a long, long time. Perhaps because of those conversations we used to have about taking care of Nick when he got old, I suppose such permanent arrangements were made as a matter of course. And I just think that we get to see the major impact she has on him then, because they made these plans, they talked through these things, and she had become a portion of his life that probably maybe he thinks at this moment might have meant something even more than Nick. I don't know how to interpret that in that moment, but she is truly foundational for him, and his storytelling is impacted by the work that she does with him, the relationship they have, if I can use that word, the connection that they have together.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I want to make sure we leave some space to maybe dive into some of the portions of the book that maybe we had questions about, or maybe we had criticisms of. So yeah, I just want to open it up. What do y'all think are there? What are some portions that maybe you have some criticisms of?
My initial reaction to this is that this is sort of, I have an answer to that, and then also in that answer, something that I really did like about
Sure.
about the extended essay, but it's at one point. This was kind of a standout quote for me, but this is in section 9. He says, "I'm a good deal more grieved by what I'm afraid will be racism of the future than I am about that of the past." Later, he says, "I have the strongest doubts that the usefulness of a guilty conscience, or about the usefulness of a guilty conscience as a motivation." And I thought like that was, I loved that he went there, and I thought he was going to go deeper into I've been talking about the past. Now let's talk about the future. Because I couldn't help but have flashes of MAGA in my head when like in the sort of present day issues that are coming up where it was fascinating to me that in 1970 he was saying, "I'm trying to make sense of the past, but just, hey, FYI, I'm a little more concerned about what racism is going to look like in the distant future than what it's looked like in the past, because it seems to be an acknowledgement that it's not going anywhere." And yet I don't think that thread was fully, I don't think he went as far as he could have, as far as the sort of future scope, or like looking towards the future within this book. So that's I guess you call it a critique, but I mean, I know that at this time, I mean, this is, I trust Berry enough to know that this book was probably the best he could do at the time. Like it was the best thinking of its time or whatever. Sure. But I also feel like he could have gone farther as far as the not just like, oh, that's what was happening back then, or that's why I felt that way, or that's why people did that, rather than saying like in more direct terms a sort of a future-focused approach to it towards the end, which he touches on, of course, but I just wanted more.
Sure.
I agree. I think that I was concerned about some missed opportunities, as you were pointing out, to really be in conversation with what a future could look like, especially if he was concerned about it at this time period. But like you said, it's still 1970. When he's pulling all this together, a lot of people have said some things. I wondered if he would have, engaged with certain writings. I don't know why, but when I was reading through all this, I guess when I first saw that first quote from Malcolm X, I got super excited because I thought, oh my gosh, like who all is he going to engage with? The thinkers of this time, Black people who are thinking through this at this time, and as he tries to think through his personal experience. And I don't get a chance to see that happening in this work.
Yeah.
Even as I mentioned earlier, he takes a different direction with Malcolm X there when he talks about, gardening. And I was feeling like, okay, there's so many things from the autobiography of Malcolm X that he could have engaged with in all of his conversations, right? And you could probably pick any different moment to think about what Malcolm X would have probably said in conversation with him and his thoughts. And he does mention Dr. King, and I don't know. I guess I just expected something else. And I don't even know what that something else was. I know someone like James Baldwin is in conversation during this time period. I don't know how accessible James Baldwin and his thoughts would have been to Berry, and if he would have engaged in particular ways with what James Baldwin is saying at this time. So I'm just curious, because it seems like they are, of course, coming from their own perspectives, but similarly very concerned about racism, very concerned about what it meant for that time period that they were in, but also what it was going to mean to the future of America. And so I just would want to know why he does not engage with some of the other works that maybe he had access to at that time when he written this piece.
Yeah, I had the same reaction, because he there's a long section where he makes a big deal out of the fact that we need to find cultural resources or language to help us figure out what it would mean for Black people and white people to talk about the hidden wound, right? And then he talks about the Odyssey and Tolstoy and Huck Finn. Which is fine, like the passages he talks about are fine, but I'm like, yeah, but like there are Black writers.
Yeah,
so
hang on for a second while I talk about a few white people. Yeah. You know what some of my favorite white people have to say about this?
Right.
Right.
Yeah. But I'd be interested, Heather. You mentioned James Baldwin. Are there particular works, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but are there particular works or ideas of his that you think our listeners might be interested in looking at as a way to sort of pick up on this thread that Berry leaves kind of hanging there?
Probably my obvious choice would be Baldwin's The Fire Next Time.
Okay.
He considers a part. Normally, if you get that text, you'll probably have the letter from his nephew, the letter to his nephew, which is it precedes what you may have read. I don't know, or what people may be more familiar with is Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's similar to Coates because it's his predecessor to this idea of talking to a young person about what it means to be who they are in America when we think in the context of racism. But Baldwin is very clear with these discussions. Like, he's being interviewed by people about his feelings about what's happening in America with race, even what he sees as what's gonna have to happen for both Black and white people as there's work to be done. He leaves questions for white people to think about and to answer. And so I'm even thinking, since Baldwin is being interviewed on television about this stuff, like, does he not engage with TV in particular ways? Is he not seeing the conversations that Baldwin is having, which are very distinct and direct? And I would think he would have been inspired by that, right? To think through who he is as a white man in this discussion. So I just thought immediately of that in some of the conversations. And if people want to even Google, they can look up some of, I think one of them was a PBS interview that's done with Baldwin, where he talks about this. He's even, I think, if I'm not mistaken, Baldwin is often in like court spaces, maybe the UN, a lot of academic spaces where he's talking about this stuff. And so I thought, like I said earlier, seeing early on that quote from Malcolm X, I thought, oh, wow, he's really going to engage with, even Langston Hughes or Angela Davis. So many people that he could have thought about them in terms of what they have to offer. And just historically, some of the things that already happened in areas like Birmingham, Alabama, which were major events that you could see the violence that racism, how it violently impacts communities and people. And I thought, like, there are a lot of sermons and court interviews, testimonies, I'm trying to even think. So the thing about me is I'm not a historian. I couldn't make it. I always thought I would be, but I can't because I'm not good at things. But I think that even Fannie Lou Hamer probably had been, NBC News had her up for a quick second. Lyndon Johnson did not like it, so they took her off quickly. But she was on NBC News for like a little bit. She described like her experience of just trying to register to vote. And so that's why I was just like, I thought he would have taken an approach to incorporate those voices, but I don't know where he is in 1970. I don't know what space he's in as he's trying to think through all of this and unravel all of this in his adult mind.
Yeah. I think that is an excellent observation, and there's a gaping void in this essay of talk of Dr. King and of these figures.
He mentions them once.
Once.
Yeah.
Once. This is 1970. It's not like it was 1959 or something. It was one time.
Right.
And so, but also and so as you were describing, like, surely he had seen James Baldwin on TV. I was like sort of like chuckling under my breath because I was like, oh, he famously doesn't have a TV. Because Wendell Berry is this sort of like Luddite. So I was like, I recently bought a copy of an essay that was written much later, but it was called Why I Don't Own a Computer. Is that the title?
Why I'm not going to buy a computer.
Why I'm not going to buy a computer. And he says I don't have a TV and I will never have. And we will get to that. And there are some issues with that essay. Right. But at the same time, I'm like, he's the guy, like the equivalent today of the person who, like, you talk about some like crazy thing that just broke on Twitter and they're like, I don't have social media.
Yeah, I don't have social media.
Come on. Like, okay, I'll fill you in. Like, he was the 1970 version of that, where he probably had people at the university where he's working be like, do you hear Baldwin on talking to the UN or whatever? And he's like, oh, I guess I'll have to check that out. But oh wait, YouTube doesn't exist because
Yeah.
it's 1970.
I don't know.
I wonder how much he was missing out. Yeah.
I think he was a little more aware than he lets on, though.
Well, that's almost worse, though, right?
Yeah, it is. It is worse.
Because it's like he's aware, but then he didn't mention it. But
yeah. I mean, and I don't know. I even think of like cultural forms to help. Bridge the divide is not a good. It's not a good way to say it, but to help white people talk to black people and figure out how to talk through the institutional problem and the wound that is racism. I mean, I think of the work of the Highlander Center. I mean, nonviolent protest itself is a social form, is a cultural form, right?
Right.
So there's a lot of resources out there that he's not tapping into.
Right.
He does at least a tiny bit to his credit. Like we're sort of poking fun, I think rightly, that he's pulling on like all these white writers for his ideas. But he does point out, he says like it's almost his limitations. It's like, as far as in my influences, he says that he's noticed that the influences that he has within white culture that have affected him have been exiles and renegades. Like he points that out, like the ones that I find myself genuinely drawn to are the ones that have literally been like excommunicated or eccentrics, because the white culture does not, in these previous decades or whatever, has just tended not to produce popular writers or whatever that are progressive on these topics. So he talks about T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, but Thoreau and Whitman and Faulkner and William Carlos Williams, and it's like all these white dudes who have these like interesting ideas that he brings up throughout. He does point out, however, that these are people who tended to be like on the outskirts, but it's just such a swing and a miss
Yeah.
that he fails to bring in the other side of that. But
yeah. Well, I wanted to bring up here the kind of the structural argument of the latter half of the book, which is and it's something that I kind of like you, Tim. I'm kind of torn about it, and I'm interested to hear what you all made of it. His argument, like I said at the beginning, where he's really making an agrarian critique of racism, and he essentially, and we're already over an hour here, so I'll just kind of do my best to summarize the argument. Basically, that racism exists because white people, the Europeans who colonized the Americas, wanted to own the land, but thought themselves above the menial work of actually caring for the land and doing the work on the land to produce, the crops, et cetera. And so they enslaved black people from Africa and brought them over to do the work, and then invented racism out of this idea that there were certain kinds of work that were beneath them, and the slaves that they were having to do that were having to do the work, that's why they were inferior. They were doing the work that is beneath the white people. And he goes on from there to make arguments about the fact that this is part of the hidden wound in assigning this work to the slaves, and then later to the black underclass under Jim Crow. White people have sort of given up a necessary part of what it means to be human in the world. They've given up the experience of working either on the land or in sort of caring professions, and only focused on the idea of sort of owning land or owning the means of production and figuring out how to make them profitable. And also, as a result of this, Berry, makes the argument that black people develop what he calls a more authentic and a more wise or a wiser culture that sort of helps them deal with the daily grind of doing all of this manual work of caring for the land, and that this is something as well that white people shut themselves off from, because they are shutting themselves off from this kind of work.
I think he uses the phrase urban nomads.
Right.
White people turn themselves into these urban nomads.
Right.
and then let other people
Yeah.
sort of like have the
in the later times. Yeah, for sure. So there are things that I think are probably true about that characterization and the connection of economics and even ecology, because if white people are distancing themselves from the land, they're going to make decisions about the land that are going to be harmful to the land. They don't know how to care for the land or live within creation. So there are things I like about this, but I also that there are times when he's talking about Nick in particular in this regard, and he says that, and he even recognizes that it's a perilous thing for him to say, but he says that Nick is in some ways freer than his grandfather was, because his grandfather had to worry about, the profitability of the land, whereas Nick, he was poor, certainly, but he was given a place to live. He had stability, and he didn't have to worry about, the profit-making piece of
it was
the
like
land.
Grandfather's worrying about profits while Nick is just like looking forward to his next fox hunt or something that was the way that he characterizes it, which is...
So there are things I worry about there. He's walking up to a ledge that is, and maybe he's stepping over the ledge. I don't know. What do you all make? And we'll start with you, Heather. What do you make of the sort of structural argument and what that says about white culture and black culture and things like that?
I agree that to an extent it's clear that I think marginalized communities have kind of understood the importance of the land beyond capitalism or any kind of economic driven forces with it. We often continue to hear indigenous communities remind us of the purpose of the land, how the land is part of creation, and their connection with it is definitely beyond ownership. And that part of the wound is that they have, within white culture, based on what I'm seeing from Berry, they've created viewpoint of creation in the land in ways that shouldn't have. And I always think of, and I always wonder if I'm right or not, I need to read Crevecoeur again, but I think it's in a letter to the from American Farmer or something. Part of me thinks I remember him like giving a warning a long time ago when he went to one of the plantations and he saw the work that the enslaved people were doing. And then he saw the slave masters or enslavers. He saw them kind of in the house and not really able to understand what's happening on their plantations. They had gotten kind of, I guess, comfortable in a certain way as the plantations were, the enslaved people were working on the land and are very knowledgeable, right, of agriculture and what needs to happen. And he started asking them questions and they were like, couldn't really answer. And he was like, oh, this is a danger because you probably should be knowing like what's going on your land and what happens when all of a sudden this free labor is no longer available to you. And then we see the Civil War and all this kind of other history that I'm jumping right over occurs. And I think about that still, that part of that wound is there's this disconnect between some of the work that occurs. And earlier we were talking about how, enslavement, they were able to create kind of like this definition of who should be doing work in connection with race, and then creating this separation. And sometimes we can throw in poverty there to think about the ways in which we think of who should be doing certain jobs now. And I just think, that is a major force, but it's also not that simple. Because if it was that simple of us going back to the land and saying, okay, how are we treating it? How are we understanding it? What are some of the immediate impacts? I don't know. I think that's continues to be a major thing that we're thinking about now with climate change, right? As they try to remind people who are truly invested in capitalism, and oftentimes that shows you they're very invested in the racism that fuels capitalism, and you go like, how are we gonna like think about the land only in this? Because it's evolved in such a way that it's a lot of industry is just really, and I don't know if y'all been paying attention to the 1619 project with the New York Times, but as you know, they're showing like all the current connections that all kind of rolls out of this. So if you think about sugar and what's happening now, if you think about industry and what's happening now, and how a lot of this is just all tangled and tied up in what's been established in enslavement. And then as you try to work through racism with that, will returning to the land and thinking about environmental justice really be one of the ways we can do it? I definitely think it's one of the ways that we can think about it, but I'm just not sure if that's going to be a clear answer as we're trying to figure out what to do.
Yeah, I definitely, track with that. And that's just, it's easy to, I think once you get to the end of this book, it's easy to start sort of like rolling it out. And it's easy to start rolling it out into these other issues like climate change and sort of these other issues that I think he doesn't touch on because maybe he wasn't necessarily aware of at the time. But that was also, I feared that was one of the, in some ways, at least what I just said, not just what you just said, but is almost one of the weaknesses of this, because by the end of it, it sort of fizzles out where you lose that sort of rock hard sort of aim of how do we fix these wrongs or whatever. But maybe it fizzles out has a very negative connotation, but maybe a better way of saying is that by the end of it, he becomes sort of overwhelmed by the scope of everything. You know, like overwhelmed by the scope of, if I really want to talk about this book's going to be 1,400 pages long. It's going to be as long as Tolstoy, right? Or it's going to be, but he was writing it over a, Thanksgiving break or whatever it was. Like, I forget what he says at the beginning of the book. Like, he just kind of plows through this idea. But yeah, I definitely, I bumped on the sort of Nick is better off than we are sort of thing, because the people like him have learned this other way of seeing things, which is, like we've said, sort of true, but at the same time, it had this slight taste of like, and this is sort of a maybe an insensitive way of saying it, but like, man, I wish I'd been a slave so that I could have had that.
I know, you're right. I understand what you're saying. I totally understand what you're saying.
Where he says like, he brings up Thoreau again. He's like, Thoreau taught us that it's being a happy person is about understanding your minimums and doing as much as you can with as little. So wisdom might be thought of as the art of minimums or whatever. And it's like, in some ways, that's like a very sort of like making the most out of a really crappy situation, which I think in some ways opposes his original mission, which is to like address the issue, as opposed to saying like, here's how it's better than you think, which I know he's not saying it like this, but that's just like, I started to get those sort of vibes.
Well, he's aware of that. Like he brings that up. He's like, no, I know what you're going to say. Like, it's easy for you to say that,
He ends several chapters like, and I know. But
at the same time, he never really dissolves that tension and deals with that. So yeah, I still have some worry about that. I don't want to keep harping on my criticisms. Did either of you have some other topics you wanted to talk about in terms of criticisms of the book?
No, I think that with your criticism, you really kind of gave me an opportunity to talk about just some of the things with him kind of not following through, because he does a really good job of, I think you all were talking about that tension, right? Thinking through it. And a lot of times he would answer me, because in my mind I would go, okay, of course you can say that. And then he'd come back later and be like, but this is my truth. And this is how I feel. Thank you. Just wanted to make sure you understood, Barry. Thank you for like reading my mind. And also, like I said, I'm trying to think contextually about the time period, and also understanding my time period and the ways in which I would want him to respond and to see him with that. But I think that he just doesn't get a chance to think through a lot of it. And that's what I would have loved to have seen. And I know it would have been a large piece of work for him to think through it as much as possible and follow through with some of these thoughts to understand how challenging it is because we'll never know if Nick is actually quote unquote freer, right? We'll never get a chance to see that, because he doesn't get an equitable opportunity to live his life without the constraints of systems of oppression like racism. But I just wanted to see a little bit more follow through with those thoughts there.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I think that, and we haven't mentioned much, but like acknowledging the existence of the afterword that he wrote. I feel like the existence of the afterword is him acknowledging the fact that like, all right, let me take another stab at this. Let me add a little bit more.
Yes.
And he probably got to a point where maybe some of these subjects were sort of rolling out into some of his other essays and things that he was writing, that he stopped sort of adding on to this.
Right.
Hidden Wound didn't become his like leaves of grass of racism in America, where he was just like adding to and adding to and adding to. I don't know, but I think that at least to acknowledge that he seemed to be aware of this a little bit, that he knows he could have given it more attention, and he tried to, and because I think ultimately we ended on our sort of criticisms, or we're wrapping up with our criticisms, but I certainly feel personally certainly better off having read this.
Yes, of course.
It's brought up some questions in my head that I haven't known to ask myself. It's told me stories that will, in sort of a edifying way, like these stories about Nick and Georgie, will stick with me and will teach me in a way that I think would please Barry. That sort of like wisdom and way of thinking would be passed along, and I value that.
Yeah.
A good bit. I think early on, I in this conversation, I said that this book felt like a series of really valuable nuggets of wisdom. But when you zoom out, it's sort of like harder to wrestle with the overall meaning. I think that'll always be the case. I don't think it's fair to put on Barry that he should have like, buttoned it up at the end and be like,
right.
Da, 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 and that is why we do that. That's the solution. So I certainly think that the reading of this has driven me towards a further search personally for more understanding, because my family is from Northeast Ohio, which was a sort of like notably anti-slavery and like Underground Railroad hub. That's where most of my family is centered, but like they like to cling to that, or you like to say that, but at the same time, I know that sharecroppers and these sort of like after effects of the mechanisms of slavery was something that my family was directly involved with, and had sharecroppers coming through and working in a way that is this sort of pseudo version where they're not being paid a whole lot, or they're doing the same kind of work they were doing before. So like not to the extent of Barry, but I know that my family has a connection of some kind to this, that I feel much, much, much more compelled to call my aunts and uncles and call my grandparents and get answers, and try to start pointing myself towards figuring out how to tell yourself the truth.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And that's sort of where I hoped we could end up here is what are, obviously now our race relations in America are still not healthy in many ways. I think that's probably an understatement. Right. But I wonder if we could talk just briefly about what if any wisdom might we be able to draw from the Hidden Wound today. And I think, Tim, what you said, especially as a white person having to sort of look critically at our own privilege, that is what I think I will take from this for sure. The posture of criticism of yourself, your family, your history, and your complicitness in these sort of structures for sure. Heather, what about you? What do you think that the Hidden Wound is something that might help your students today sort of think through racism in America?
Absolutely. I am fortunate to be able to teach a various, I guess, kind of wide-ranging course on social justice, and we are currently thinking by centering African American voices. But in this class, I have white students who stopped and asked me the question of, why don't we sit down and ask our family about like their connection to all of this? And so I never had a group like be so blunt about that. So I'm grateful that I got a chance to read this and talk through with you all about it, because it's another example for them to read, to think through how they have these questions about themselves as white Americans, They have questions about themselves in the context of their families. Even one student said he just asked his dad, like, what were you doing in 1965? And what does that mean to us? And his dad was very candid with him. And he said he was grateful for that because he didn't need to hear any kind of lies or, make anything seem any kind of way, because if we're truly going to continue to make any kind of movement, we're all going to have to sit with those questions, right? And as I mentioned earlier when we first started, I think that oftentimes Black people don't have the luxury to not have to think about it because it becomes so life or death for us. And so to see this opportunity, this model that Berry has for those who are wondering how do they have these conversations, I know my students will be able to see a piece like this and think through someone who tried to ask themselves those questions and figure things out. And so I'm grateful to have this part of my list when I hand them that, because I'm not an expert on whiteness. So I don't often know how to work with those who are committed to what they're going to do today. But I do try to keep a list of authors that they can read, whether it's fiction or any kind of theory, so that they can understand that there are people who have thought through this and who are committed to thinking about what impacts oppression, this system of oppression, when we think about racism, has on everybody.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, and me as well as a teacher of young people, like I resonate with that a lot. And then also with I think I will definitely take away his notions of these issues and how he acknowledges the sort of wisdom of youth or whatever, and also the traps that young people can fall into. So as a high school teacher, public school, high school teacher in the South, it energizes me to better understand my students in sort of an empathetic way. There's a line in the book where he says that certain mechanisms make certain young people will make themselves comfortable among the grown-ups' lies. And I loved that line, and that that line sort of sticks with me and haunts me. That's one of those where I sort of thought of specific people who you meet people who are sort of stuck in the teeth of this thing, of this lie, and they have no understanding of why they're there, right? It's just that they have sort of let themselves grow comfortable within the lies that they're surrounded by, and so it just helps me better understand them. That like he even quotes that that eventually we're supposed to put away childish things.
That's that St. Paul, right?
Yeah. He doesn't under those demands. Here's the quote. He says, as has been often enough pointed out, he doesn't understand those demands necessarily become a man in any respectable sense of the word. He is altogether likely to become a perfect snot, useless to his fellows and destructive to his community and his land. But like that idea of just like, just better understanding people who are younger, who have the opportunity to approach things from a more innocent basis, like Wendell sitting on that cellar wall kicking his legs, that they deserve our attention if we're expecting to have that sort of future focus that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, that's great. Well, is there anything else about the hidden wound that we haven't covered? I mean, that there obviously is a lot that we haven't covered, but anything else that's top of mind for you all as we close here?
Not for me, I don't think. I mean, we can't talk about everything. Right. But I feel like this was I think I will always value this conversation with the two of you, because I think this book became quickly important for me, and maybe even more important because of the problems I had with it. Right. That like the challenges that it faced, that it brought up, were almost those were important to me, because I found value in noticing the sort of downfalls of the attempt, but knowing that not personally as if I'm like on the same par as him, but that it's like an opportunity to sort of take what he's done here and then try to keep moving the ball down the field, right? Like moving the ball forward. Right. So I don't think there's anything else on my mind.
I would agree. I think the value for me in the conversation we've had, and just for you all, give me an opportunity to encounter Berry's work this way. Increasingly, the questions that I receive are about who's supposed to be doing what.
Right.
And in many cases, I'm always directing people back to their individual behaviors and their investments in human rights. And so to be able to point to certain texts to help them better understand a more personal approach with some of the memoir-like pieces of this work really gives me a chance to continue to help those students and whoever I'm coming in contact with as they go like, hey, who's supposed to be doing this work? If we're trying to figure out how to make this world a better place for everybody, and racism, as we mentioned earlier, right, that we are far from the type of work that needs to be done with this. And so it gives me a chance with this conversation I've had with you all and with reading Berry's work, it gives me a chance to continue to have a place or a site for me to direct people to have larger discussions as they try to figure out who's supposed to be doing what, how are they supposed to be doing it, and what avenues can they follow. So I'm excited to continue to talk about this book with other people and some of the gems I think you were mentioning earlier, some of those nuggets, right, that come out of it, that what can we do with what others are writing about. And so I'd love to see, I may even think about like creating a class where like he's in conversation with a whole bunch of other people, really complicating this whole idea of race. But I'm excited to continue to see how this impacts the way I teach, the way I make connections with others, and the way I'm able to help people think through that really tough question of what kind of humans are we going to be?
That's great.
You've got an awesome opportunity there in what you're describing to bring in those voices that you identified as absent, like and saying, okay, he there was a swing and a miss with some of these that he didn't approach. So like, let's do it. Let's do it here. What do you, it's a really valuable thing for students to think about is like, what do you think Berry would say to James Baldwin? Or what do you think he would say to these different characters? That's
sounds like a good essay assignment.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, I would certainly take or audit that class. That sounds great.
Amen.
Yeah.
I will keep you updated.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, Heather, thank you so much for joining us here on the membership. I don't think we could have had this conversation without you. I really appreciate the perspective you brought.
Thank you all so much for just being gracious and open. I really do appreciate you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, friends, for listening to Season 2, Episode 1 of The Membership. The excerpts read in this episode can be found in The Hidden Wound, which was written by Wendell Berry and is published by Counterpoint Press. In Season 2, our goal is to release a new episode every other week. In Episode 2, you'll hear John Pattison's interview with David Klein, the Amish author, writer, and editor. And then, in Episode 3, we'll pick back up with Berry's fiction, discussing 2 short stories, A Half Pint of Old Darling and The Lost Bet, both of which can be found in the collection That Distant Land. If you like what you heard, please take a few minutes to rate and review us on iTunes. This helps others find our podcast. And if you'd like to chip in financially to help with the work of the membership, visit patreon.com/membershippod. You can also connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram at the handle membershippod, or find us online at membershippod.com. The membership is a proud member of the Rabbit Room Podcast Network. To discover other great podcasts, visit rabbitroom.com/podcasts.